James Harden, 10-time All-Star, 1-time MVP. Kyrie Irving, 8-time All-Star, 1-time NBA champion. Kevin Durant, 1-time MVP, 2-time champion, 2-time Finals MVP. One of the most talented, accomplished big threes of all time. Also one of, if not the most underwhelming big three of all time. They failed to win a championship. They didn't even make it to the finals in their own conference. There's a bevy of reasons one can list, but the point remains that this super team, headlined as the KD Kyrie era of the Brooklyn Nets, did not live up to the hype nor the potential. This recent Nets squad joins a list of failed super teams in the history of the NBA. The already stacked Warriors with Curry, KD, Klay, and Dre adding DeMarcus Cousins in the 2018 offseason, but losing to the Raptors in the 2019 finals. I guess you can count the 2012 Thunder as a super team with an asterisk, given that they had 3 future MVPs on their squad ready to enter their primes. The most infamous case of a failed super team has to be the 04 Lakers, with a prime Kobe and Shaq that recently three-peated but added former superstars Karl Malone and Gary Payton now at the tail ends of their careers. They fell short in the finals against the Detroit Pistons in one of the biggest upsets in NBA history. So yeah, sometimes super teams fail, but for one franchise to have 2 failed super teams, that's extremely exclusive company. The Lakers are on this short list with their 04 shortcoming, and a super team in 2012 featuring Kobe, Powell, with the additions of Dwight and Steve Nash. Mainly due to injuries and age, this team got swept in the first round by the San Antonio Spurs. But the other franchise that has 2 failed super teams is now the Brooklyn Nets, with the debacle of the KD and Kyrie era and the super team, quote unquote, that formed in 2013 featuring a starting 5 of Deron Williams, Joe Johnson, Brook Lopez, and 2 former Celtics stars, Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce. I'll dive into the details of the 2013 Nets later, but I just wanted to establish my goals for this video. I wanted to compare and contrast the aspects of these 2 super teams, quote unquote, given that they're of the same franchise and only a decade apart. And I also kinda just wanted to revisit the collapse of that Nets era in 2013 and kind of how it sparked the path to this most recent era of Brooklyn basketball. But to compare these 2 quote-unquote super teams, I have an outline. First, I'll examine the tenures in their entirety and dive into the reasons for the shortcomings, aka lack of success in the playoffs. Next, I'll turn my attention to the collapses themselves, how these teams on paper fell apart. And lastly, that will be the aftermath segment. For the 2013 squad, I'll dive into how the future looked for the team and what actually transpired. As for the modern Nets, it's going to be a lot of hypothesizing. Though I do want to start with the modern Nets. I know KD and Kyrie signed in 2019, but KD was missing the entire season due to injury, so I wouldn't say that they fell short that season. The time we'll analyze starts in the 2020 to 2021 season and obviously ends at the trade deadline in 2023. This time frame encompasses 3 seasons, or 2.5, and all in which the Nets were entering each season as a series title contender. Starting in the 2020 to 2021 season, this is when the Nets traded for James Harden in the first third of the season, forming the Big Three. As you could expect, this team was elite offensively. I mean, we're talking about 3 of the most skilled offensive players the world has ever seen, all on the same team. This season was shortened due to COVID complications, but the Nets went 48-24 for second in the Eastern Conference. While this team was incredibly gifted offensively, there were a lot of defensive concerns. They finished 23rd in defensive rating. Injuries arguably took a bigger toll on this team. The Big Three were only able to play in 16 games together throughout the entire tenure, let alone just that season. In the Eastern Conference semifinals against the Bucks, Harden and Irving were both compromised and were only able to play 4 of the 7 games. KD didn't miss a game, he went God mode, and the Nets were only a half shoe size away from eliminating the Bucks, the eventual NBA champions. Moving into next season, their championship aspirations were valid. We assumed we'd see a full season of the Big Three with much better health than last season. The Nets also signed marquee vets like Paul Millsap and LaMarcus Aldridge. And with expected strides from Bruce Brown as their top young player at the time, things were looking bright for the Nets. But yeah, things wouldn't go very well. The team finished 44-38 for 7th in the Eastern Conference. The season was derailed by off-the-court issues. Due to COVID mandates, players were required to be vaccinated in order to suit up. Kyrie refused due to his personal and spiritual beliefs. I commended him for standing firm on his values, but that did mean that he wouldn't be able to play in home games for Brooklyn. Nash ended up deciding that he didn't want Kyrie as a quote-unquote part-time player, only playing in away games because he deemed it bad for the team. The mandate was lifted midway through, and Kyrie was able to play again. As for KD, he unfortunately was in and out of the rotation due to injury, and for James Harden, he butted heads with Nash regarding his offensive role, and I'm pretty sure he was affected by the Kyrie drama. Harden unofficially pushed for a trade out of Brooklyn, and his request was granted, landing him in Philly. In return, the Nets got Ben Simmons, who was disgruntled and hadn't played a single game for Philly. Seth Curry and Andre Drummond, those two would be very valuable rotational pieces for Brooklyn. As said before, the Nets finished 7th and had a rematch with the Celtics in the first round due to a lack of depth, lack of defensive personnel, and a lack of the star in Ben Simmons that they traded James Harden for, among other things. The Nets were swept. Finally, the 22-23 season, another season in which the Nets were a valid championship contender for simply having KD and Kyrie and the hopes that Ben Simmons could bring the much needed size and defense. Not much to detail, since if you're watching this vid, you don't need in-depth detail. But I'll go over it quickly. Ben Simmons, his debut was highly anticipated, but he got off to a slow start. He was brought in to be a high-level playmaker and an incredible versatile defender. His overall impact was null early on due to a very apparent lack of aggression, nothing changing regarding his lack of contribution to spacing the floor, and his mitigated defensive impact due to constant foul trouble. He was relegated to a bench role and has been in and out of the rotation due to multiple minor injuries. We know what happened with Kyrie. He had to take time away from the team due to a social media snafu. Overall, this team still had common struggles from years past. Lack of size or big man depth behind an emerging Claxton, and the culmination of all this fluff was the firing of Steve Nash. From this point, the Nets had a resurgence. KD was playing like an MVP, Kyrie not far behind, and Claxton was continuing on his career year. Coupled with the return of key role players like Joe Harris and Seth Curry, this team reached third in a very top-heavy Eastern Conference, and things were looking up. Of course, there's a but. KD suffered a significant lower body injury that he's still recovering from to this day. Before the season, Kyrie was looking for a contract extension, but Brooklyn was hesitant due to Kyrie's inconsistent availability. Fast forward to February, inching closer to the contract extension deadline, and as far as the general public knows, the Nets had a somewhat disrespectful offer for Kyrie. We can assume he was fed up, wanted to go somewhere with more long-term security. He possibly let the Nets know that he'd leave in free agency for nothing if they didn't trade him. And voila, a day or so after his request, he's traded to Dallas. Not too much later, KD is traded to Phoenix, and just like that, when Brooklyn was turning a corner and establishing themselves as a contender again, they go through a monumental collapse because of off-the-court issues. Traveling further back in time, let's now look at the shortcomings of the quote-unquote super team Nets in 2013. For this era, we're only looking at 2 seasons because KG and Pierce only played for this team for 1.5 and 1 season respectively. The Nets had the 4th best championship odds going into the 13-14 season, but fell to 15th before 14-15. We'll see why soon enough. But in the 2013 offseason, as we all know, the Nets made one of the most notable trades in NBA history, sending out Gerald Wallace, Chris Humphries, and Tourniquet Shengelia, apologies for a potential mispronunciation, Reggie Evans, Keith Bogans, and 3 unprotected first-round picks in 2014, 2016, and 2018. Now, on the surface at the time, I guess the trade didn't look too bad, and there was reason to believe in this team's championship potential. The season prior, the Nets went 49-33 for 4th in the conference with a big 3 of Brook Lopez, ISO Joe, and Deron Williams. Brook was coming off an all-star season and entering his prime. Deron was still known as one of the best point guards in the league, no longer in the convo with CP3 in the top 2, but still in the upper echelon. And ISO Joe was still a certified bucket getter. As for the acquired veteran stars, KG was just an all-star a season ago, and Pierce was still a bucket getter, not as prolific but still an efficient marksman from outside. So the Nets pushed all their chips to the middle of the table. And hindsight is 2020, so we know how this turns out. A very underwhelming season, Nets going 44-38 for 6th in the conference. A pessimist could have predicted this if they paid attention to the evident danger signs. KG was 37, Pierce 36. They both had a sizable fall off in their first season in Brooklyn. This team was also defensively challenged. Joe, Darren, and Pierce were never great on the defensive end, so the perimeter defense was weak. Brook Lopez at this point in time was known as an offensive big. He wasn't known as anything near the defender he's known as today. And KG, like I said, had a fall off. Couple all this with the fact that they had a first-year head coach at the helm in Jason Kidd. The Nets beat the Raptors in the first round, but were clearly overmatched by the Big Three in Miami and lost to them in the second round in 5. One season later, this team wasn't looking very super. In the 2015 offseason, Pierce bolted to Washington in free agency. J. Kidd was traded as a coach. Yes, a coach got traded. He was traded to Milwaukee. In the middle of the 14-15 season, KG waived his no-trade clause for the homecoming in Minnesota that would happen via a trade. Darren Williams and Joe Johnson both showed their first signs of regression with significant statistical drop-offs. Darren's drop-off can be attributed to injuries. Given that this team was supposed to be bolstered by an elite starting 5, the supporting cast was very lacking, and defensive issues from the prior year persisted into 2015. The team finished 38-44 for 8th in the Eastern Conference. They lost in the first round to the first-seeded Atlanta Hawks. So we just dove into the actual shortcomings of the respective super teams and the reasons behind them. Now let's look at the collapses themselves. Starting with the original Brooklyn Nets quote-unquote super team, Darren Williams was waived in 2015, Joe Johnson was waived during the 15-16 season, and Lopez was traded in the 2017 offseason for D'Lo. This was said earlier, but I'll restate that Pierce left after his one and only season in Brooklyn, and KG was traded to Minnesota for Thad Young. I guess we can mention that Jason Terry was traded for Alonzo G and Scottie Hobson since he came with Pierce and KG from Boston. Now we can take a look at the flow of general assets. As for the OG Nets, there was only a return for Brook Lopez getting D'Lo and Mozgov, given that Joe Johnson and Darren Williams were waived. Here's the flow revolving around the mega trade that occurred in 2013. In the end, the Nets traded Gerald Wallace, Chris Humphries, Tornike Shengelia, Reggie Evans, Keith Bogans, and 3 unprotected first-round picks for Thaddeus Young, Alonzo G, Scottie Hobson, and 1 playoff series win in 2 seasons. Pretty damn underwhelming. As for the modern Nets, the collapse was the James Harden trade during the 2021-22 season, and then the Kai and KD trades that happened at this recent deadline. Here's a flow map for the superstars they signed in 2019. I'd say a pretty damn good return, especially for KD, getting Mikal Bridges, who I think has 20 point per game potential, and Cam Johnson as a valuable shooting forward, along with 4 unprotected firsts, is about as good as the Nets could have hoped for. They also got Dinwiddie with 3 picks in the return for Kyrie. Now here's a flow map for the star they acquired via trade in James Harden. In the end, Jared Allen, Karis LeVert, 3 unprotected firsts and 4 pick swaps became Ben Simmons, Seth Curry, and 2 first-round picks, and just 1 playoff series win. Yeah, they gave up a lot of firsts just to pretty much get 1 full regular season out of Harden and a hampered postseason just for us to turn into Ben Simmons, basically. Lastly, let's examine the aftermath. As for the quote-unquote super team of 2013, we'll first look at the time frame of 2015 to 2018. Over 3 seasons, the Nets went 69 and 177. It was going to be an uphill battle, missing so many draft picks and a lot of them being tied up in swaps, where Brooklyn had the worst half. So while these Nets were having 20-win seasons, they had no chances at getting even a lottery pick. With the picks they had in the late first round, in this time frame, they connected on 1 in 2017 with Jared Allen. Drafting him was one of the marquee moments of this era, along with signing Spencer Dinwiddie in 2016, acquiring D'Lo in 2017, and trading for Karis LeVert. The years of losing and some savvy acquisitions led to the 2018-2019 season, which was fun as hell for the Nets. Kenny Atkinson was a promising new coach. D'Lo was the lead shot creator. Jared Allen was establishing himself as a potential high-level, rim-running rim protector in his second season. Joe Harris made a name for himself as an upcoming elite sharpshooter. This team had a lot of close, entertaining games in the regular season, and who could forget the bench mob? In the playoffs, the Nets were able to push the 76ers to the most entertaining 4-1 defeat that I've seen in my life, featuring a viral Ben Simmons, Jared Dudley moment. This team played hella free and hella fun. I think that display made Brooklyn more attractive in free agency, hence them landing KD and Kyrie in the ensuing offseason. As for the aftermath of the KD-Kyrie era, it's going to be very interesting. The future of this team is a lot more promising than the future of the 2016 Nets. The modern Brooklyn front office was able to liquefy their former Big Three for multiple first-round picks over the next 6 years. The Suns' unprotected first towards the end of the decade will be interesting to monitor. Not only did the Nets get draft capital, but they also got promising talent in return. Mikal is one of the league's best defenders, and like I said earlier, I think he has some untapped potential on the offensive end. Spencer Dinwiddie is a tremendous offensive point, and he's back in Brooklyn. I mentioned Cam Johnson. This team is really deep. They should definitely be competitive on any given night, and they have incentive to do so. They won't be tanking, and they actually have talent to compete, unlike that of the Nets from 2015 to 2018. From here on out, the Nets are going to be testing the potentials of guys like Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Cameron Thomas, and Nick Claxton. Nick Claxton is a high-level rim-running center, great on the defensive end, and particularly great at switching on point guards and shooting guards in pick-and-roll action. I think he has Defensive Player of the Year potential moving forward in his career, and he's still really young. Cam Thomas had a string of 40-point games. He obviously has potential as a lead shot creator and is wired to score, but he's going to have to round out his game to really raise his ceiling as a potential star in this league. Because of Brooklyn's enhanced depth, Coach Vaughn has him playing that scoring sixth man role. Cam Johnson is 26, but his time in Brooklyn will see him featured in the offense much more than he was in Phoenix. I think he's eager to take on a higher usage. Bridges, of course, is the prized piece of this trade. He is also 26, but like I said, I think he has a higher offensive ceiling to reach. And in his 3 games in Brooklyn thus far, he's exemplifying that potential, averaging 25 points on 54% from the field and 57% from 3. They'll also be monitoring Ben Simmons and hoping that he can get back to the guy we saw in Philly before the infamous Hawks series. Though I'm a tad more pessimistic on that note, with the departures of the offensive superstars, I think he'd be eager to kind of take the reins of this team and operate with so much spacing in Cam Johnson and Mikal being added to this team, along with Cam Thomas already being here, Spencer Dinwiddie, another 40% three-point shooter, guys like that around him. But he still seems content with being a screen center, dunker spot roamer, and an occasional playmaker in the full court. I think it's apparent that his confidence as a former all-star in this league has been zapped. Though, to close things out, both net super teams were hyped up immensely, but both teams were incredibly underwhelming. However, this recent installment is by far more underwhelming. 3 top 75 players of all time on the same team couldn't even make it to the conference finals. And often, the incredible on-court display of unmatched offensive talent was overshadowed by the media's coverage of the things that transpired off the court. While this recent installment was more underwhelming, they do have a brighter future compared to that of the 2015-2016 Nets, given all the draft capital and quality talent they were able to acquire for their traded stars. While the 2015-2016 era Nets took a long while to morph into the fun-loving loose team of the 2018-2019 season, you could say that the remains of this recent super team debacle is already at that fun, low-stakes, play-free stage of basketball. Only time will tell how this rebuild will go.